Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world, night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. There was a bed of soil in that garden that had not been planted in over 50 years. 3 women had knelt beside it, across 3 separate lifetimes. 2 of them died, without ever telling anyone why it mattered. A bird returned to it every single spring, the same corner, the same patch of bare earth, and simply watched it, waited, as if it knew something no one living was willing to say out loud. One of those women had a sister she did not speak to for 30 years. One of them left behind 7 handwritten books and a single locked cabinet, with instructions that only one person alive was allowed to open it. And on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in a flat 200 miles away, a woman named Alice opened an email that was about to hand her all of it. The garden, the silence, the sister no one had ever mentioned, the apology that had waited 3 decades to be spoken and was never finished in time. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew her great-aunt was dead and that some kind of inheritance was waiting for her. She had no idea how much a single garden could be asked to hold. It began, as these things so often do, with a letter she almost didn't read properly. She had been standing at the kitchen counter of her flat in Bristol, waiting for the kettle, scrolling through nothing in particular, when the solicitor's email arrived with a subject line that took her a full minute to understand. Estate of Margaret Wren. She had known, distantly, that her great-aunt Margaret was unwell. She had not known that unwell had become gone, quietly, in her sleep. In a stone cottage at the edge of a village, Alice had visited perhaps 4 times in her whole life. The last of those visits so long ago, she could not have said with any certainty how old she had been. The email was polite and brief in the particular way of solicitors' emails, full of words like probate and beneficiary and at your earliest convenience. And beneath all of that, plain as anything, the fact that the cottage was hers now. The cottage and the garden behind it, and whatever the garden contained. She read the email twice standing at the counter, the kettle forgotten, clicking off behind her with its small definitive sound. She read it a 3rd time sitting down. She thought about her great-aunt Margaret, the way you think about a person you have mostly constructed from other people's descriptions of them. Difficult, her mother had called her once, though not unkindly, more the way you'd describe weather. Set in her ways. Lived alone in that garden of hers for the better part of 50 years and never once seemed to want for company. Alice had met her exactly 4 times, once as a very small child, a memory so faded it was more sensation than image, the smell of turned earth and something green and bitter, a woman's hand steadying hers as she stepped over a low stone wall. Once at 10, sullen and bored, dragged along on a family holiday that had taken a detour through the village for reasons she no longer remembered, made to sit in a kitchen that smelled of drying herbs, while the adults talked about things she had no interest in. Once at 16, briefly, at a funeral for someone else, her great-aunt, a straight-backed figure at the edge of the gathering who had looked at Alice for a long moment and said nothing at all. And once more, the last time, at 23, when she had gone through a period of driving aimlessly on weekends and had found herself, almost by accident, on the lane that led to the cottage, and had knocked and had been let in, and had sat in a kitchen with a woman she barely knew, and had talked for perhaps 2 hours about nothing memorable, and had left with the vague sense that something had passed between them that she did not have the vocabulary to name. That had been 11 years ago. She had not gone back. She had meant to, the way you mean to do many things. And time had done what time does, which is simply continue, indifferent to intentions. Now, the cottage was hers, and the garden, and whatever the garden contained. She thought, sitting at her kitchen counter with her tea going cold beside her, that she ought to feel something more definite than what she felt, which was a kind of low, diffuse unease, the sense of a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. She called the solicitor that afternoon. His name was Mr. Aldous, and he had the unhurried, patient voice of a man who had delivered this particular kind of news many times before and had long since worn the drama out of it. He explained the terms simply. The cottage and its grounds passed to her outright. No complications, no other claimants. There was, he mentioned, almost as an aside, a set of books that her great-aunt had been particular about, kept in a locked cabinet in the garden shed, a set of instructions left specifically that they should go to Alice and no one else, and that she should be the one to open the cabinet herself. Alice asked what kind of books. Garden books, Mr. Aldous said. Almanacs, I believe she called them. I confess I haven't looked closely. She was very particular that they weren't to be handled by anyone but you. Alice sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment after he had said his goodbyes and hung up, looking out of her kitchen window at the narrow strip of concrete that constituted her own outdoor space, on which sat 2 pots of geraniums she had bought at a supermarket and had, so far, managed not to kill. She was not, by any reasonable measure, a gardener. She gave her notice at work 2 weeks later. This surprised her more than it surprised anyone who knew her. She worked in a role she had drifted into rather than chosen, doing something with spreadsheets for a company whose actual purpose she had never fully understood, despite having worked there for 6 years. And when she handed in her resignation, she found herself unable to explain, even to herself, exactly why she was doing it, only that the cottage sat in her mind now like a stone in a shoe, small and constant and impossible to ignore, and that she suspected she would go on being unable to ignore it until she had actually gone and stood in it and understood what it was that had been left to her. She told herself it was temporary. A few weeks, she said to her mother, who had reacted to the whole business with a complicated mixture of surprise and something that might have been envy, just to sort things out, decide whether to sell. Her mother had gone quiet on the phone for a moment and then said, in a tone Alice hadn't quite been able to pass, "Well, she always did like you best, in her way." Alice had not known what to do with that sentence and had let it pass. The drive took the better part of 4 hours, the motorway giving way eventually to smaller roads, and the smaller roads giving way to lanes so narrow that Alice found herself holding her breath at every bend, Certain a tractor or a delivery van would appear from nowhere, and there would be no room for either of them. The countryside closed in gradually the way it does, hedgerows rising on either side, the sky narrowing to a strip overhead, the light doing something soft and gold as the afternoon wore on, until she came around a final bend, and the village revealed itself all at once. A scattering of stone buildings around a green, a church with a square tower, a shop with a hand-painted sign, and beyond it, up a lane that climbed gently away from the village center. The cottage. She recognized it immediately, though she had not seen it in 11 years, and had not been at all sure she would remember the way. Some part of her, apparently, had kept the route stored away without her knowledge. The cottage was smaller than she remembered, low and stone-built with a slate roof gone silvery with lichen, a chimney at each end, windows set deep into walls that must have been 2 feet thick, a gate in a low stone wall. And beyond the gate, though she could not yet see it properly from the car, the suggestion of the garden, a wall of dark green rising behind the house, taller than the house itself in places, disciplined and wild at once. She parked on the verge and sat for a while, with her hands still on the wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at the cottage the way you look at a face you are trying to place. It gave nothing away. It simply waited, the way old stone buildings do, patient, in a manner that made the word patient feel inadequate, because patience implies an alternative, implies the possibility of impatience, and the cottage seemed to Alice to exist entirely outside of that particular calculation. It had been here a long time. It intended to remain a long time more. Whether she came inside or turned the car around and drove back to Bristol seemed, in that moment, a matter of near total indifference to the building itself. She got out of the car. The key Mr. Aldous had posted to her was old and heavy, brass gone dark with age, and it turned in the lock of the front door with a resistance that suggested the door did not open often, though she knew that couldn't be true, that her great-aunt had lived here until only a few weeks before, had presumably come and gone through this door every day of her life for the better part of 50 years. Perhaps it was only that the door remembered a hand different from Alice's own, and required a moment to adjust. Inside, the cottage smelled of dust and something else beneath it, something dry and green, and faintly bitter that Alice couldn't immediately place, and then did place, all at once, the way scent memory works, arriving whole rather than assembled. Herbs, dried herbs, hung somewhere, or stored somewhere. The smell worked so deeply into the walls and the furniture that it had become simply the smell of the house itself, indistinguishable from the stone and the old wood and the years. The front room was small and dim, curtains drawn against a sun that had, presumably, been considered an enemy to whatever was kept within, and Alice crossed to the window and drew them back, and light came in across a room that was, she saw now, extremely tidy, not sparse, exactly. There were books, a great many books, on shelves that lined one entire wall, and furniture that looked old without looking neglected, well used and well cared for, a worn armchair by the unlit fire, with a small table beside it, holding a single mug, empty, rinsed, waiting, as though her great-aunt had simply stepped out for a moment and would be back shortly to finish whatever she had been doing. Alice stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, feeling the peculiar weight of being alone in a dead woman's home, surrounded by the specific, particular evidence of a life that had continued in exactly this way, in exactly this room, for longer than Alice herself had been alive. She thought, I did not know her at all. She thought it without self-pity, simply as a fact to be absorbed, the way you absorb the temperature of a room when you first walk into it. She spent the rest of the afternoon moving slowly through the cottage, not with any particular purpose beyond acquainting herself with it, the way you might walk the perimeter of a property before deciding what to do with it. A kitchen at the back, small and well-equipped in an old-fashioned way, iron pots hanging from hooks, a scrubbed wooden table, a window above the sink that looked directly out onto the garden, so that whoever stood washing dishes here would have spent that time every day looking at exactly what Alice could see now, a wall of green climbing up and away from the house, glimpses of paths, of structure, of something clearly vast and clearly deliberate, though from this angle she could make out no more than its edges. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms, one clearly her great-aunt's, the bed neatly made, a wardrobe of plain, practical clothes, and one that seemed to have been kept, in some undefined way, for a guest who rarely, if ever, came. Alice put her bag down in the second room without quite deciding to, the way you make a small commitment without noticing you have made it. It was not until early evening, the light beginning to slant low and gold through the west-facing windows, that she went out into the garden itself. She had expected, she realized, as she stepped through the back door and onto a stone path worn smooth by years of feet, something more contained than what she found. The garden was walled, the same warm grey stone as the cottage, but the walls enclosed a space far larger than the modest footprint of the house had suggested, extending back and to either side in a series of what she would later learn to call rooms. Though in that first evening she understood only that the space kept revealing more of itself the further she walked, each turn in the path opening onto something new, a bed of something silver, leafed and fragrant, an arch smothered in something climbing and thorned, a small stone bench positioned to catch what must once have been the last of the evening sun. It was, even to her untrained eye, extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily particular. Nothing here had happened by accident. Every planting, every path, every low box hedge, dividing one section from the next, spoke of a mind that had considered this space for decades, had shaped it and reshaped it, had known exactly what it wanted from every square foot of soil within these walls. And it was, she saw, as she moved further in, beginning, in places, to slip. Not badly, not yet, but there were weeds pushing up through gravel that had clearly once been kept scrupulously clean, and a climbing rose that had come loose from its ties and hung now at an angle that spoke of neglect, weeks rather than years, the neglect of illness rather than abandonment. And Alice felt something in her chest tighten at the sight of it, the particular grief of seeing a thing that had been loved beginning, very quietly, to come undone. She reached the far wall as the light was truly beginning to fail, and found there a small wooden shed, weathered grey, with a door secured by a padlock that looked considerably newer than the shed itself. She had, she realized, without quite planning to, been walking toward this the whole time, some instinct guiding her feet even as her mind occupied itself with the roses and the gravel and the low ache of grief for a woman she had barely known. She did not have a key to the padlock. She stood in front of the shed for a while regardless, in the gathering dusk, with the smell of the garden all around her, green and cool and complicated, 100 different scents she couldn't name, layered one over another, and thought about what Mr. Aldous had said. A set of books, almanacs, kept for her and no one else. She would need to go back to the solicitor's office in the morning for the second key. She went back inside as the last of the light went out of the sky, and made herself tea in her great-aunt's kitchen, and sat at the scrubbed wooden table with her hands around the warm mug, listening to the particular quiet of a house at the edge of a village, at the edge of nowhere in particular, a quiet unlike anything she was used to, without the hum of traffic or neighbors or the low electric buzz of a city that never fully went dark. Here the darkness outside the window was complete, and the quiet inside it was complete, and Alice sat inside both of them and found, to her surprise, that she did not mind it. She thought, I could stay a few days. She thought it the way you think a thing you already suspect is not quite true, a few days already beginning, somewhere beneath the thought, to feel like the wrong unit of time entirely. She slept better that first night than she had slept in months, in the narrow guest bed beneath a window that let in more starlight than she had seen in years, and woke to birdsong so loud and so close, it took her a confused moment to remember where she was. The solicitor's office was above the village shop, up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked with a specificity that suggested they had been creaking in exactly that pattern for a very long time. And Mr. Aldous turned out to be a small, precise man of perhaps 60, with the gentle, unhurried manner Alice remembered from the phone, and a way of looking at her over his glasses that made her feel, not unpleasantly, that he was taking her measure. He had the key ready, a small brass thing on a loop of string, and he handed it to her along with a folder of paperwork she would need to work through eventually. And as she was leaving, folder under one arm, key in her closed fist, he said, almost as an afterthought, your great-aunt came in every few months, right up until the end, always to update her will, if you can believe it. Same instructions every time, more or less. Everything to Alice. The books to be opened by Alice alone. I asked her once why she bothered updating something that never changed. Alice waited. She said, Mr. Aldous told her that it wasn't the will she was updating. It was making sure she still meant it. Alice walked back to the cottage with that sentence turning over in her mind. The whole way, the lane climbing gently beneath her feet, the hedgerows thick with the last of the summer's growth, small birds moving through them with quick, private purpose. And she thought about a woman she had met 4 times in her life, who had, apparently, spent years quietly and repeatedly confirming that she still wanted this particular thing to be true, without ever once picking up the phone to say so to the person it concerned. She reached the shed a little before noon, the sun high and warm, the garden loud with insects, and the particular thick, green smell of high summer, and she fitted the small brass key into the padlock and felt it turn with far less resistance than the front door had shown her the day before, as though this lock, at least, had been oiled and tended and kept ready. Inside, the shed was cooler than she expected, dim, smelling of wood and old paper and something else, faintly medicinal, herbal, the same undertone that ran through the whole cottage. There was a workbench along one wall, tools hung above it in a precise order. She recognized as the same instinct that had shaped the whole garden. And against the far wall, a low wooden cabinet, glass-fronted, the glass slightly wavy with age, And behind the glass, a row of books. She counted them without meaning to. There were, she thought, perhaps a dozen, bound in cloth of varying colors, gone soft and faded with handling, their spines uneven, where they had clearly been pulled out, and returned to their places many hundreds of times over many years. She found the cabinet unlocked, its own small key already turned and left in the lock, as though her great-aunt had wanted to make this last barrier, at least as easy as possible. Alice opened the glass door. The hinges made almost no sound at all. She lifted out the first book, the oldest looking, its cloth cover a deep faded green, and opened it to the first page, and found there, in handwriting that was not her great-aunt's, angular and old-fashioned and pressed hard into the paper, a single line: "For whoever comes after me, and tends what I have started, and understands, eventually, that a garden is never really finished, only ever handed on." Beneath it, a name. Not Margaret. Someone else entirely. Someone Alice had never heard of. She sat down on the low stool beside the workbench, the almanac open on her lap, and began, in the cool green light of the shed, to read. The handwriting belonged, she understood within the first few pages, to a woman named Eleanor Wren, and the almanac was not a diary in the way Alice had imagined, not a record of days, but something closer to what its title suggested. A garden's memory kept across seasons rather than dates, organized by what Alice would come to think of, once she understood it properly, as companionship. Not January, not February, but early cold and first thaw, and the long light, and the turning, beneath each season heading. Notes on what had been planted where, and beside what, and why, written not as instruction exactly, but as observation, the kind of thing you write down not because you expect to forget it, but because writing it down is itself a form of attention, a way of honoring the fact that you noticed. The foxgloves want the shade of the north wall, but resent the wet that gathers there in the long light. Plant them a hand's width higher than seems necessary. They will thank you for it later, though not for some years. Alice read that line 3 times. She had never planted a foxglove in her life. She found, nonetheless, that she understood exactly what it meant, or thought she did. Some part of her already translating the specific language of soil and shade into something more general, about patience, about trusting a decision whose wisdom would not become visible for years. She read on. The early pages of the almanac, in Eleanor's hand, described the garden as though it were being built from nothing, walls going up, beds being dug and turned and fed, the long, slow work of making a space capable of holding what its maker wanted it to hold. Eleanor wrote of the garden the way, Alice thought, some people write of children, with a kind of ferocious, exacting tenderness, alert to every weakness and every strength, determined to give it everything it needed and nothing it did not. And then, perhaps a third of the way through the first volume, the handwriting changed. It was a smaller hand, rounder, less certain of itself in the way that new handwriting always looks, less certain beside handwriting that has had decades to settle into its final shape. And beneath the new entries, a note that read, simply, Margaret continues this, as her mother taught her, though not as her mother would have done it, which is, I think, as it should be. Alice sat very still in the cool green light of the shed and understood, with a small jolt that was not quite surprise and not quite grief, but something adjacent to both, that Eleanor Wren had been her great-aunt's mother, her own great-great-grandmother, a woman who had built this garden from bare ground, who had written the first third of this book, who had handed it, at some point Alice could not yet date, to a daughter named Margaret, with instructions that amounted, more or less, to do this your own way, and it will still be right. She turned the page and kept reading, and Margaret's hand carried the almanac forward through what must have been years, the seasons cycling and cycling again, the same headings recurring: early cold, first thaw, the long light, the turning, but the entries beneath them, changing, deepening, a young woman's careful observations gradually becoming an old woman's certain ones, the whole trajectory of a life laid out in the specific, patient language of what she had planted and where and why. Alice read for a long time in the shed, the light outside the small window shifting slowly from midday to afternoon, and found, somewhere in the second volume, an entry that made her stop entirely. "The robin has come back to the corner by the east wall," Margaret had written, in a hand Alice now recognized, having spent an hour inside it, as unmistakably her great-aunt's own, though younger, the letters not yet worn into the particular slant they would eventually take. "He does this every year now, has done for 3 years running. Always the same corner, always watching the same bed, as though he is waiting for something to be planted there that I have not yet planted. I do not know what he expects. I have left the bed empty. I think, perhaps, I am waiting too, though I could not tell you for what." Alice looked up from the page, through the small window of the shed, toward a corner of the garden she had not yet properly explored, and found, without entirely meaning to, that some part of her had already begun to wonder what a robin might be waiting 3 years, and then, apparently, far longer than 3 years, to see planted in an empty bed, at the edge of a walled garden in a village she had barely known, existed until a fortnight ago. She closed the almanac gently, the way you close something you understand, without yet being able to say how, that you are going to spend a great deal of time inside. Outside, the afternoon had gone soft and gold, the particular light of high summer beginning its long, unhurried decline toward evening, and Alice sat for a moment longer, on the low stool, in the cool green shed, the second almanac still unopened on the bench beside her, and thought about her great-aunt writing that entry, young enough still for her handwriting to be unsettled, old enough to have already understood that a garden asks you to wait for things you cannot fully explain, and to keep waiting, year after year, without any guarantee that the waiting will ever resolve into anything at all. She thought, "I want to see that corner." She stood and put the first almanac carefully back into the glass-fronted cabinet, and carried the second one out with her into the light, and went to find the east wall. The garden, she was beginning to understand, did not reveal itself all at once to anyone, not even, she suspected, to Eleanor or Margaret, who had built it and tended it across the whole of their lives. It revealed itself in the manner of the almanac itself, section by section, season by season, a slow accumulation of understanding that could not be rushed, no matter how much a person might want to rush it. She found the east wall by walking the perimeter path, past beds she had glimpsed the evening before, past the climbing rose that had come loose from its ties, which she stopped to look at properly now, seeing in the wilted, sprawling growth, not neglect exactly, but a kind of exhausted persistence, a plant that had kept doing what it knew how to do, even after the hand that shaped it had stopped coming. The east wall, when she reached it, ran along the boundary furthest from the house, in partial shade for most of the day. The light there, thinner and cooler than in the beds nearer the cottage, and there, exactly where the almanac had described it, was a bed, smaller than most of the others, bordered in the same low box hedging that divided the rest of the garden into its rooms, and entirely, deliberately, conspicuously empty. No weeds. Even someone, right up until very recently, had kept this small square of soil turned and clean and utterly bare, a held breath in the middle of all that abundant, deliberate growth. And on the low wall behind it, watching her with the particular stillness of a bird that has decided a person is not, for the moment, a threat, sat a robin. Alice stood very still. The robin regarded her with one bright, dark eye, its head tilted at an angle that seemed, to Alice's admittedly untrained sense of these things, faintly expectant. She thought of Milo, briefly, absurdly, a cat in a bookshop, in a story someone had once told her, though she could not now recall where she had heard it, some half-remembered thing from childhood, or from a program on in the background of some other room, a creature that watched a door for someone who might or might not come back. She did not know why the association arrived, only that it did, and that it felt, standing there in the thin, cool light of the east wall, with an empty bed at her feet, and a bird watching her from 3 feet away, entirely appropriate. She said, out loud, to no one, to the bird, to the garden, I don't know what's supposed to go here. The robin did not answer, being a robin. It watched her a moment longer, and then dropped from the wall to the bare soil of the empty bed, and picked, with great precision, at something invisible to Alice, and then flew off toward the denser growth further along the wall, leaving her alone with the empty square of earth, and the low afternoon light, and the distinct, unshakable sense that she had just been shown something important, without yet having the almanac's help in understanding what it was. She opened the second volume there, standing at the edge of the empty bed, and found, near its final pages, in her great-aunt's hand grown steadier now, more settled, the entry she had somehow known she would find. The robin came again this year, 4th year running. I have begun to think of the bed as his, though of course it is not his at all. It is simply waiting, the way I suppose I am waiting, for something I cannot name and would not know how to plant, even if I could. I told myself I would leave it 1 more year and then give up the waiting and plant something sensible there instead. I have told myself this for 3 years now. I do not think I mean it when I say it. And beneath that, in a hand Alice did not recognize at all, smaller than Margaret's, hurried in a way none of the rest of the almanac's careful entries had been, a single, unexpected line, wedged into the margin as though added later, as though someone other than Margaret had, at some point, opened this book and left a mark of her own. I am sorry. I should have written sooner. I did not know how. No name, no date. Nothing to explain who had written it or when, or what precisely they were sorry for. Alice stood at the edge of the empty bed, with the almanac open in her hands, and the light beginning, finally, to turn toward evening, and felt the particular vertigo of having been handed, without warning, the edge of a much larger story than the one she had believed she was walking into. She thought, "Someone else has been in this book." She thought, "I need to keep reading." She closed the almanac and carried it back toward the house. The empty bed and the low stone wall and the memory of the watching robin left behind her in the thickening gold light. And did not yet know that this was only the first of many evenings she would spend exactly this way, carrying one of Eleanor and Margaret's careful, patient books back into the cottage kitchen, reading by lamplight at the scrubbed wooden table until the words blurred and the tea went cold, following two women's handwriting forward through decades of seasons toward whatever it was the empty bed had been waiting, for longer than Alice had yet begun to understand, to receive. That first evening, she made a simple supper from what she could find in the kitchen and ate it at the table, with the second almanac open beside her plate, and read on past dark, the lamp casting its small, warm circle of light across the pages, the rest of the kitchen falling away into the particular soft darkness of an old house at night. No streetlights, no distant traffic, only the occasional settling creak of stone and timber that had been settling in exactly this way for longer than anyone now living could say. She read of Margaret's middle years, the garden reaching what Alice understood, even without expertise, to be a kind of maturity. The trees Eleanor had planted, as saplings now casting real shade, the roses that had been trained along the walls as thin whips now thick and established, their canes as wide as Alice's wrist in places. She read of visitors mentioned only obliquely, a niece who came one summer and asked too many questions, a neighbor's boy who was paid in strawberries to help with the heavier digging, a vicar's wife who wanted cuttings and was given them, always, generously. Margaret's notes suggesting a woman who kept her own counsel closely, but gave of the garden's abundance without hesitation, and she read, with a growing, uneasy fascination, of the empty bed by the east wall, which recurred through the years, not constantly, not obsessively, but at intervals, a paragraph every season or two, always brief, always circling the same unresolved question. The robin, or perhaps a long line of robins, indistinguishable to a human eye but perhaps not to each other, returning year after year to the same corner, watching the same square of bare earth, and Margaret watching the robin and writing, each time, some version of the same thought. Not yet. I do not know why. Not yet. It was very late, the lamp burning low, when Alice found the second unexpected line, this one further along than the first, in a different position on the page, as though the same hand had returned at a different time. To leave a second small mark, I think of the empty bed more than I should. I know what she meant it for. I have known for years. I am still not ready to say her name here, even now. Alice read this 3 times, the way she had read the foxglove line that morning, though for entirely different reasons, and felt the tiredness that had been gathering behind her eyes for the last hour, sharpened suddenly into something closer to alertness. Someone had been reading this almanac, someone who was not Margaret, and who had known, or come to know, something about the empty bed that Margaret herself either did not know or would not write down. Someone who referred to her, without ever naming her, with the particular, careful evasion of a person protecting either the person named or themselves. She looked at the handwriting again, comparing it as best she could in the low lamplight to the first note she had found. The same hand, she was fairly sure, small, hurried, apologetic in its very shape. The letters leaning forward, as though eager to be finished with themselves. She thought about her mother's strange comment on the phone. She always did like you best in her way. She thought about the 4 brief meetings that constituted the whole of Alice's relationship with her great-aunt, and wondered, for the first time, really wondered, rather than simply accepting as background fact, why there had been only 4 across the whole of her life, when the cottage was not so very far from where she had grown up, when a drive of a few hours could so easily have been made more often by either of them. At any point across 3 decades, she thought, there is something in this family nobody has told me. She sat with that thought for a long moment in the quiet kitchen, the lamp throwing its small, steady light across the Almanac's open pages, the dark pressing gently against the windows. And then, because it was very late, and because the reading had begun to blur pleasantly at the edges the way reading does when sleep is finally, genuinely close, she closed the book and banked what remained of the kitchen fire, and climbed the narrow stairs to the guest room, and lay for a while listening to the particular deep quiet of the garden at night, the occasional soft call of some bird she couldn't identify, the wind moving very gently through growth she had not yet fully explored, and thought, before sleep finally took her, not yet, and did not know, quite, whether the thought was hers or Margaret's or the garden's own, worn so deeply into the place by now that it had become something closer to a property of the air itself. She woke the following morning to full sun and birdsong and the specific, disorienting comfort of having slept more deeply than she could remember sleeping in a very long time, and lay for a while in the narrow bed watching the light move across the low ceiling, before the events of the previous day arrived back into her mind all at once. The almanac, the empty bed, the robin, the 2 unexplained lines in handwriting that was not her great-aunt's own. She went downstairs and made tea and carried it out into the garden while it was still cool. The grass wet with dew, the whole walled space hung with the particular hush of early morning before the insects have properly started their work, and found herself walking, without quite deciding to, back toward the east wall, toward the empty bed, to see whether the robin would be there again. It was, perched on the same low section of wall, watching the same bare square of earth, with the same patient, expectant stillness, as though it had not moved at all in the night, as though it existed only in relation to this one small task, watching, waiting, keeping some kind of appointment that had been made long before Alice arrived, and would, presumably, continue long after she had either fulfilled it or failed to. She sat down on the grass a little distance away, mug of tea warm in her hands, and watched the robin, watched the empty bed, and thought about Eleanor Wren, who had built this garden from nothing, and about Margaret, who had tended it for the whole of her adult life, and about the unnamed her that the almanac's second, unexplained hand had circled without ever quite naming, and about her own mother's strange, weighted comment on the phone, and felt, sitting there in the wet grass, with the morning light beginning to warm the walls around her, the first real stirring of something that was not quite grief and not quite curiosity, but some new thing assembled from both, a determination however unformed, to understand what exactly it was she had inherited and why. She spent the whole of that second day in the garden and the shed by turns, working her way slowly through the second almanac. And, starting by the afternoon on the third, the seasons cycling forward through years, she could now begin to place, roughly, against the small facts she did know of her own family's history. And she found, as the sun moved across the sky, and the light in the walled garden shifted from the thin gold of morning to the thick green gold of midday to the long, slanting amber of early evening, that she was no longer reading only to understand the garden. She was reading to find the next line in that second, hurried, apologetic hand, and to understand, at last, whose it was, and what exactly it was that had never quite been said. It was near the end of the third almanac, the light beginning to fail again, the lamp not yet lit, that she found the passage that changed the shape of everything she had assumed so far. It was in Margaret's hand, not the mysterious second one, but it was different from every entry that had come before it, longer, less concerned with soil and shade and companion planting, more like something she had needed, finally, to set down in full rather than in the brief, circling fragments she had allowed herself before. "My sister came today," Margaret had written. "The first time in 11 years, I did not know what to say to her, so I showed her the garden instead, which has always been the only language I have ever fully trusted." She stood at the east wall for a long time and did not ask about the empty bed, though I could see she had noticed it, the way anyone notices the one thing that has been deliberately left unfinished. I did not offer an explanation. She did not ask for one. We are neither of us, I think, women who ask for the things we most want to be given freely. Alice sat very still in the failing light of the shed, the third almanac open on her lap, and read the word sister twice, and then a third time, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very still, the particular stillness that comes just before a piece of understanding arrives whole, before you have quite assembled the reasoning that will justify it. She did not, as far as she had ever known, have a great aunt who had a sister. Her family tree, such as she understood it, ran in a single clean line, Eleanor to Margaret, and then, somewhere along the way, a branch that led eventually to Alice's own mother, and then to Alice. Nobody had ever mentioned a sister. Nobody had ever mentioned, in fact, very much about this side of the family at all, beyond the vague, weathered facts that had drifted down to her, the way such facts do. This great aunt existed. She lived alone. She kept to herself. She and your grandmother did not speak much, for reasons nobody had ever thought to explain, and Alice had never thought, until this exact moment, to ask. She closed the almanac slowly, and sat for a long moment in the darkening shed, with her hand still resting on its faded cloth cover, and understood, with the particular vertiginous clarity of a fact finally slotting into a shape that had been waiting, unacknowledged, for its arrival, that the sister Margaret had written of, the one who had come once in 11 years and stood without speaking at the edge of an empty bed, was very likely, was almost certainly, Alice's own grandmother, which meant the unnamed her in the empty bed's long unresolved story was not a stranger at all, which meant the second, hurried, apologetic hand belonged, quite possibly, to someone Alice had grown up believing she knew completely, and had never once suspected of carrying, quietly, for the whole of her life, an apology she had never found the courage to finish. Outside the shed's small window, the last of the light was going out of the sky, and the robin, somewhere beyond the glass, would be settling for the night in whatever hidden place it kept, and the empty bed by the east wall would be lying open to the coming dark, exactly as it had lain open for years before Alice had ever known it existed, waiting, still, patiently, for whatever it was that 3 generations of women in this family had each, in their own way, found themselves unable to finish saying. Alice gathered the almanac to her chest and walked back through the darkening garden toward the warm-lit window of the kitchen, the grass cool and slightly damp against her ankles, the whole walled space around her settling into the particular hush of evening, and thought, with a clarity that felt, for the first time since the solicitor's email had arrived, entirely her own rather than borrowed from 2 dead women's careful, patient hands, that she was not going to be able to leave this place until she understood the whole of what it was trying, so quietly and for so long, to tell her. She made supper again that evening, and ate it slowly, and afterward sat by the small fire. She had finally worked out how to lay properly, the 4th almanac unopened on her lap for a long while as she simply watched the flames, turning over what she had read, letting the shape of it settle before she went looking for more. She thought about her grandmother, a woman she remembered mostly as quiet and careful and slightly sad, in a way Alice had, as a child, simply accepted as a feature of the woman rather than a symptom of anything in particular, the way children accept the given facts of the adults around them, without curiosity, without the imagination to wonder what history might sit beneath a particular stillness, a particular reluctance to talk about the past. She had died when Alice was in her early 20s, quietly, in a hospital bed, with Alice's mother beside her, and Alice herself 200 miles away, finishing an exam she could no longer even remember the subject of. She tried now to recall whether her grandmother had ever mentioned a sister, a garden, a village, and found only blankness where such memories should have been, which was not, she realized, slowly, the same thing as evidence that nothing had ever been said. It was only evidence that Alice, as a child, and then as a distracted, self-absorbed young adult, had never once thought to listen closely enough to notice if it had. She opened the 4th almanac, a little after 9, the fire settling into its low, steady glow, and found that Margaret's hand, in these later pages, had grown noticeably older, the letters looser, occasionally shaky, in a way that spoke of hands beginning to feel the years, though the careful attention behind them had, if anything, deepened rather than faded. The entries here spanned what Alice guessed to be the final 15 or 20 years of her great-aunt's life, and the garden they described was a mature thing now, fully itself. The early anxious notes about whether a planting would take, having given way entirely to the settled, confident observations of a woman who had watched this exact space through enough seasons to know it, finally and completely, on its own terms. And the empty bed, when it appeared differently now too. Less a question, more a fact, simply being tended, the way you tend any other part of a garden that has become, through long habit, part of its permanent structure. The robin still came, every year, the same corner, the same patient watching, and Margaret's notes about it had softened into something almost companionable, Two old presences keeping the same quiet vigil together. Neither one, any longer, expecting a swift resolution. It was perhaps 2/3 of the way through this fourth volume that Alice found the passage that told her, finally, plainly, in Margaret's own unambiguous words, who the empty bed had always been for. I think I have known, for a very long time now, that I am not planting this bed for my sister to see it finished, Margaret had written. Sometime, in what Alice guessed to be her great-aunt's late 60s or early 70s, the hand steady here, deliberate, the words chosen with the particular care of someone who has turned a thought over for years before finally allowing themselves to write it down. I do not think she will come back a second time. I understand now that this is not because she does not wish to. I understand now that some absences are not refusals at all, but simply the shape grief takes when it has nowhere else to go. I am planting this bed, if I ever do plant it, for whoever comes after both of us and finds it empty and wonders why, and is patient enough to ask the garden itself, rather than either of us, for the answer. Alice sat with the fire burning low beside her and read this passage a second time, and then a third, and felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite recognition, but some new alloy of the two, forged specifically. It seemed, for this exact moment, in this exact kitchen, with this exact book open on her knees, she thought, she meant me. She thought it without any real certainty that it was true in any provable sense, only the deep, settled conviction that arrives, sometimes not from evidence but from the accumulated weight of everything that has led you, step by patient step, to a particular door. And she understood, sitting there in the firelight with the whole garden sleeping quietly beyond the dark windows, that she had a great deal more of this almanac left to read, and that somewhere within its remaining pages, or within the volume still waiting in the shed's glass-fronted cabinet, she was going to find, at last, whatever it was that Eleanor and Margaret and the unnamed sister, with her hurried, apologetic hand, had spent the better part of a century circling without ever quite bringing themselves to say aloud. She banked the fire and climbed the stairs and lay for a long while in the narrow guest bed, listening to the house settle around her, the particular deep silence of the countryside pressing softly against the windows, and thought, before sleep finally came, about a bird that had kept faith with an empty bed for longer than most people keep faith with anything at all, and about what it might mean to be, finally, the one who filled it. She slept that night without dreaming or without remembering that she had, and woke the next morning already reaching, before she was even properly awake, for the 5th almanac. The 5th volume was thinner than the others, its cloth cover a faded rust color, and Alice understood within the first few pages why. This was not a book that spanned decades the way the others had. This was a single, concentrated stretch of time, the entries closer together, more frequent, sometimes several within what seemed to be the same week, as though whoever was writing had needed, during this particular stretch of her life, to set something down almost daily, the way you reach for a steadying hand when the ground beneath you has begun to feel uncertain. She is not well, the first entry read, in Margaret's hand, though older now, more careful in its unsteadiness. The letters formed with the visible effort of a hand that had begun, at last, to tire. My sister is not well. I had this from her daughter, who telephoned yesterday evening. The first time anyone from that side of the family has telephoned this house in longer than I care to count. She did not say very much. I do not think she knew very much to say. I asked whether I should come. She said she did not know. I understood this to mean that the decision, if it was to be made at all, would have to be mine, and that no one on the other end of that silence was going to make it easier for me by asking outright. Alice sat at the kitchen table with the morning light coming thin and gold through the window above the sink, and read this entry with a slow, dawning recognition that made the hair rise faintly on her arms. Her sister's daughter. A telephone call. The first, in longer than anyone cared to count. She thought of her own mother, and of the particular, careful way her mother had always spoken of this side of the family. Brief and factual, and entirely without warmth. The tone of someone reciting facts about a country she had visited once, briefly, and had no particular wish to return to. She turned the page. I went. The next entry read, dated some days later. I do not know, even now, what I expected to find. She was smaller than I remembered. This is, I understand, what illness does to people, though it startled me all the same. Seeing her diminished in a hospital bed in a room that smelled of nothing at all. None of the smells I associate with her. None of the smells I associate, I suppose, with either of us. The smell of this garden being, in some strange way, the smell I have always most closely associated with family, which perhaps says everything that needs saying about how far apart our lives grew. We did not talk about the years. There did not seem to be time for it. Or perhaps there was time, and neither of us knew how to use it. I told her about the roses. She asked whether the foxgloves had ever settled properly in the north bed. I told her they had, eventually, though it took the better part of a decade. She smiled at that. It was the closest either of us came, in the whole of that visit, to saying anything true. Alice set the almanac down on the table for a moment and pressed the heels of her hands briefly against her eyes, feeling something building behind them that she recognized, distantly, as the specific pressure that precedes tears, though she could not have said exactly who or what she was crying for. Two old women, sisters, sitting in a hospital room talking about foxgloves because it was the only language either of them still trusted, after decades of silence had worn away whatever other vocabulary sisters were supposed to share. She read on. The entries continued for some weeks, growing shorter as they went, the handwriting growing less steady, and then, abruptly, changed. The new hand was the one Alice had been waiting for, though she recognized it instantly. The same small, hurried, forward-leaning letters she had already found twice in the earlier volumes, and beneath it, for the first time, a date and a signature both, as though whoever was writing had finally, after two unexplained fragments left anonymously in the margins of someone else's book, decided that this entry, at least, needed to be claimed. My mother died on Thursday. The entry began, and Alice's breath caught, because there it was, plainly, the word that answered every question the almanac had circled for 4 volumes without ever quite asking outright. My mother died on Thursday, and I am writing this in her sister's kitchen, at her sister's table, because I did not know where else to put what I am feeling, and because Aunt Margaret told me. When I arrived this morning with nothing packed and no plan, beyond simply needing to be somewhere that was not the hospital, that the Almanac has always been the place this family puts the things it cannot say aloud. I did not know that until today. I do not think my mother ever told me, though I suspect, now, that she meant to, at some point, and simply ran out of the specific kind of time that telling requires. My name is Catherine. I am, I suppose, cataloguing this properly. For whoever reads this after me, since that appears to be the tradition, I am Margaret's niece. I am also, though I have spent most of my adult life trying very hard not to think about it, the reason my mother and her sister stopped speaking 30 years ago over a disagreement so old and so tangled that I am not entirely sure either of them, by the end, could have explained it clearly to a stranger. I know only my mother's version, and I understand now, sitting in this kitchen with Margaret moving quietly about behind me, making tea neither of us has any real wish to drink, that a version is exactly what it is, not the truth. A shape the truth took, once, in the mouth of someone who needed it to be bearable. Alice read this passage twice through, very slowly, and then sat back in her chair and looked out through the kitchen window at the garden beyond, green and steady and indifferent to everything she was learning within these walls, and thought about the word niece, and understood, with a small jolt that rearranged, quietly but completely, everything she had assumed about her own place in this story. Catherine was not her grandmother. Catherine was her mother. She sat very still with that fact settling into place, feeling the whole shape of the last several days rearrange itself around it, no longer a story about a great aunt and a nameless estranged sister, 2 generations removed, but a story that ran directly and unbroken into her own life, into the woman who had said, on the phone, in a tone Alice had not been able to pass at the time, "She always did like you best," in her way, a sentence that made an entirely different, much heavier kind of sense now that Alice understood exactly whose favor was being discussed, and exactly how complicated a thing that favor must have been to receive. She turned the page, her hands not quite steady, and read on. "I do not know why I am the reason," Catherine had written, in an entry some days later, the handwriting slightly more settled now, as though the act of writing itself had begun to do some of its slow, patient work. "Margaret will not tell me outright, though I think she wants to. I think she has wanted to for 30 years and has simply never found the moment that felt right. And I understand now, watching her move through this garden, with the particular careful attention she gives to everything, that she is a woman for whom very few moments have ever felt right, that she has spent her whole life waiting for a rightness that circumstance was never going to hand her freely, and that this, more than anything else, might be the actual shape of what kept her and my mother apart. Not a single disagreement. A whole lifetime of 2 women who both needed, more than anything, to be asked, and neither of whom could quite bring themselves to do the asking. She showed me the east wall today. There is a bed there, empty, that she has kept clean and turned for years. And when I asked her what it was for, she looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at me and said, "I have been waiting to find out." I did not understand what she meant. I am not sure I understand it now, but I have decided to stay a little longer than I originally planned. to help her with the parts of the garden she can no longer easily manage on her own. And perhaps, in the staying, I will come to understand it properly. Alice closed the almanac slowly, her hand resting on its faded rust-colored cover, and sat for a long while at the kitchen table with the morning light climbing steadily up the wall opposite, thinking about her mother, 30 years younger than she was now, sitting in this exact kitchen, at this exact table, working through grief and estrangement, and a family silence so old it had outlived the disagreement that started it, and about an aunt neither of them had ever properly explained to Alice. An aunt Alice's own mother had, apparently, once known well enough to help in this very garden. She thought about the phone call days earlier, standing in her flat in Bristol with the solicitor's email still glowing on her screen. She always did like you best, in her way. She wondered now whether her mother had known all along exactly what waited in that shed, in that glass-fronted cabinet, in the careful, patient handwriting of 3 generations of women who had each, in their turn, found some things too large to say aloud, and had trusted them instead to the slow, steady language of a garden. She thought, I need to call her. She did not. Not yet. She sat instead with the thought a while longer, turning it over the way Margaret had turned over the empty bed for years before. Finally, perhaps, coming to understand what it wanted, and then she rose from the table and carried the 5th almanac out into the morning light, back toward the shed, back toward the 6th volume, waiting patiently in its glass-fronted cabinet, because she understood now, with a certainty that had nothing left in it of doubt, that she was not going to be able to stop reading until she had reached the very last page, and understood, finally and completely, what it was her family had spent so long, and at such cost, trying not to say. The 6th almanac was bound in a blue so faded it had gone nearly grey, and when Alice opened it in the cool green light of the shed, she found that the handwriting inside belonged, for the first time in the whole set, not to Eleanor or to Margaret, but almost entirely to Catherine. The realization sat strangely in her chest. She had spent 3 days now moving through the careful, patient record of 2 women she had never properly known. And here, without warning, was her own mother's hand, younger than Alice had ever seen it, since the handwriting she knew belonged to shopping lists and birthday cards and the occasional terse note left on the kitchen counter, not to anything so careful, so considered as this. I have decided to stay through the autumn, the first entry read, dated some weeks after the one that had closed the previous volume. Margaret did not ask me to. I do not think she would ever ask anyone for anything directly, which I am coming to understand is not coldness, as I always assumed it was, when my mother spoke of her, but something closer to a kind of fear so old. It has become simply a feature of her, indistinguishable now from the rest of her character, the way a scar becomes, eventually, simply part of the skin. I have decided to stay because I do not know what I am meant to do with my own grief yet, and because this garden, strange as it sounds to write down, seems to know more about how to hold grief than I do. Alice read on through entries that spanned, she gathered, the better part of a season, Catherine's hand growing steadily more confident on the page, the observations shifting gradually from the tentative, second-hand notes of someone new to the work towards something that read, unmistakably, like a woman finding her feet in a language she had not known she already half spoke, inherited perhaps without her knowledge, the way certain instincts pass down a family, whether or not anyone ever names them directly. Margaret showed me how to divide the peonies today. One entry read, "She did it the way she does everything, without excess explanation, simply guiding my hands to the right place on the root ball and letting me feel where it wanted to be separated." I asked her how she knew. She said that if you spend long enough with a thing, it stops being a secret and starts being obvious, and that this was true of gardens and, she thought, though she said this more quietly, of people too, though she had spent so long avoiding people that she had lost most of her fluency in that particular subject. I told her I did not think that was true. She looked at me for a long moment, and then went back to the peonies and did not answer. And I understood. The way you understand certain things about people only once you have spent real time in a room with them rather than simply hearing about them secondhand, that this was as close as she was likely to come, for now, to admitting that she wanted very badly for it not to be true either. Alice smiled. Reading this, a small, unexpected warmth moving through her at the thought of her mother, 30 years younger, learning to divide peonies from a great aunt neither of them had spoken of in all the years since. And she read on, the entries carrying her through what she gathered was the whole autumn and into the beginning of winter, Catherine's voice growing more and more at ease on the page, until, near the final third of the volume, she reached an entry that made her sit back slowly in her chair. I asked her about the bed by the east wall today, Catherine had written. I had been putting it off for weeks, I think because some part of me already suspected the answer and did not want to hear it confirmed. She was quiet for a long time before she answered, long enough that I thought perhaps she was not going to. And then she said that she had left it empty because she had never quite believed, in all these years, that either of us, my mother or myself, would ever actually come. She said she kept it clean and turned every season regardless, the way you keep a room ready for a guest you have stopped expecting but cannot quite bring yourself to stop preparing for. I asked her what she would have planted if she had believed we were coming. She did not answer that either. Not directly. She only said that some things could not be chosen in advance, that a garden, properly understood, tells you what it wants rather than the other way around, and that she supposed she had been waiting all this time to find out what this particular piece of earth was asking for rather than deciding for it. I think, though I did not say this to her, that she has been waiting for the same thing my mother was waiting for, all those years apart. Not a plant, not even, really, an apology, though I think both of them would have taken one gladly, had either found the courage to offer it. I think they were both waiting simply to be wanted back, in some plain, undeniable way, after decades of a silence that neither of them had ever fully chosen, and neither of them had ever quite known how to end. Alice set the almanac down on her knee and looked out through the small shed window at the garden beyond, gold now in the mid-morning light, and thought about her mother's voice on the phone, careful and strange. She always did like you best, in her way, and understood with a fullness that had not been available to her even a few minutes before, that her mother had known, all along, exactly what this cottage held, exactly what the empty bed had been waiting for, and had said nothing, had let Alice come here and discover it all for herself, page by careful page. The way, perhaps, this family had always preferred to let its truths be discovered rather than told. She thought, again, I need to call her. This time the thought carried more weight than it had the day before. Less an idea she was turning over, and more a decision quietly arriving at its own conclusion, the way certain decisions do, not through argument, but through accumulation, the slow gathering of enough understanding that action becomes, finally, simply the next obvious thing she did not call yet. There was more to read first, and some instinct in her, patient in a way she did not fully recognize as her own, but suspected. Now, she had inherited from exactly the women whose handwriting she had spent 3 days following, told her that the calling would mean more, would carry more truth in it once she had reached the end of what the almanacs had to tell her. She read through the rest of the 6th volume that afternoon, Catherine's entries growing sparser as winter closed in, the final pages of the book describing, in brief, unadorned lines, a departure. "I am going back to London on Thursday." One of the last entries read, "I have a job waiting, and a flat, and a life that has been patiently holding its shape without me for 3 months. And I do not think I can ask it to wait much longer. I told Margaret I would come back in the spring to see what the garden does next. She said she would like that. I do not know if either of us fully believed it, saying it, but I think we both wanted, very much, for it to become true regardless." The final entry in Catherine's hand was shorter than any that had come before it. Only a few lines, dated, Alice noted with a small ache, some weeks after the one describing her departure, as though written not in the cottage at all, but somewhere else entirely. Sent, perhaps, or carried back on a later visit, and added, "Then, I have been home a month now," it read. "I think of the garden more than I expected to. I have not told my mother I saw her sister. I do not know how to begin that conversation, and I am beginning to suspect that this not knowing how to begin is the very thing that put the silence there in the first place. Passed down now, apparently, to me, whether I want it or not. I am going to try to be better than that. I am not certain, yet, what better looks like. I think perhaps it looks like going back in the spring, the way I said I would, and not letting that promise become one more thing this family quietly allows to lapse." Alice closed the 6th almanac and sat for a long while in the shed with the last of the afternoon light slanting gold across the workbench, thinking about her mother at 23 or 24, sitting somewhere in a London flat Alice had never seen, making a private promise to herself about a kind of courage she had not yet learned how to practice. And she thought, with a tenderness that surprised her by its intensity, that she wanted very badly to know whether that promise had ever been kept. There was one almanac left in the cabinet, the 7th, its cover a deep, worn brown, considerably thicker than the others, as though it spanned a far longer stretch of time, and Alice understood, lifting it out into the fading light, that this would be the one that carried the story all the way to its end, to whatever had finally happened, or failed to happen, between her mother and her great-aunt, in all the years since that unfinished promise, up until the moment Margaret herself had stopped writing, quietly, in her sleep, in the cottage Alice now sat behind. She carried it inside, rather than reading it in the shed, some instinct telling her that this last volume deserved the warmth of the kitchen, the lamp, the fire, the particular ceremony she had come, over these few days, to associate with sitting down properly with these books rather than simply passing through them. She made tea. She lit the fire. She sat at the scrubbed wooden table with the 7th almanac open before her, and she began, as the light outside finally failed completely, to read the last of what her great-aunt and, it seemed, several other hands besides, had left for her to find. The 7th volume opened not with Margaret's hand, nor with Catherine's, but with a third. One Alice had not yet encountered anywhere in the earlier books, larger and rounder than either of the others, unmistakably older, unmistakably formed by a hand that had learned to write in a different era entirely. And beneath the first entry, a name that made Alice's breath catch even before she had finished reading the line itself. "My name is Rosalind," the entry began, "and I am, I suppose, the reason any of this exists at all, though I have never had the courage, until now, to say so plainly. I am Margaret's sister. I am Catherine's mother. I came to the cottage this spring, the spring my daughter promised she would return to see, and I came without telling her. I was coming because I did not trust myself to keep the promise if I had time to talk myself out of it first." Alice read this opening line 3 times, her tea going cold beside her, the fire settling into its low, steady glow, and understood that she had found, at last, the voice she had been circling for 3 days, the sister whose name Margaret had never once written, the her that the earlier fragments had refused to identify. Present here at last, in her own hand, telling her own version of a story Alice had so far only heard second-hand through the careful, patient observations of the sister and the daughter who had loved her, each in their own complicated way, across a silence neither of them had chosen. "I have not spoken to my sister in 31 years, Rosalind continued, "and I find, now that I am finally sitting in her kitchen writing this, that I no longer remember, with any real precision, what began it. I know the shape of the story I have told myself for 3 decades, the version where I was wronged and she was proud, and neither of us would bend first. I suspect, now, sitting here, that this version has worn smooth, with handling the way a stone in a riverbed wears smooth, all its original sharp edges rubbed away by years of being turned over in the same tired grooves, until what remains bears only a passing resemblance to whatever actually happened. What I know for certain is this. My daughter came here 3 years ago now, after I fell ill, and stayed through an autumn, and learned to divide peonies from a woman I had spent 30 years describing to her only in the coldest, most guarded terms, and came home changed, in a way I could see plainly, but did not know how to ask about. She promised Margaret she would return in the spring. She did not return. I know why she did not return. She did not return because I could not bring myself to ask her about it, and because my silence, unintentionally but completely, taught her that the subject remained closed, that whatever door had opened during those months here had been, by my own unspoken insistence, quietly shut again. I am not proud of this. I am writing it down because Margaret told me, when I arrived unannounced at her gate 3 days ago, an old woman she had not seen or spoken to in 3 decades, standing at her garden wall like a ghost who had finally worked up the nerve to knock, that the Almanac has always been where this family puts what it cannot otherwise find the words for. I did not understand, at first, what she meant. I understand it now. I have been sitting in this kitchen for the better part of an hour, and I find that I am not able to say aloud, even to my sister, sitting 3 feet away from me at this same table, most of what I have just managed to write on this page. Alice sat very still. the fire crackling softly beside her, and read the rest of this long, careful entry, with a lump building steadily in her throat. Rosalind's voice unspooling across the page with the particular unguarded honesty of someone who has finally, after decades, given herself permission to stop protecting a version of events that had long since stopped serving her. She wrote of the original disagreement, which turned out, in the end, to be smaller and more foolish than either sister had allowed it to remain in memory. A dispute over their own mother's care in her final illness, over decisions made and not made, over who had shown up and who had not, over words said in grief and exhaustion that neither of them had ever taken back. Not because they meant them, but because taking them back would have required an admission of fault that pride and then habit and then simply the accumulated weight of years had made increasingly impossible. She wrote of raising Catherine largely alone, of the particular loneliness of estrangement, the way it does not announce itself as a single wound, but settles instead into the ordinary fabric of a life, a Christmas with one fewer place set at the table, a piece of news you almost pick up the phone to share before remembering, again, that you no longer share such things, a grief when their own mother eventually died, that had nowhere proper to go, because the one person who might have shared it fully was the one person Rosalind could not bring herself to call. And she wrote, in the final pages of that first long entry of the empty bed, Margaret showed it to me this afternoon, Rosalind wrote. I recognized it before she said a word. Catherine had described it to me once, years ago, in the careful, oblique way she has always described this place, as though she sensed even then that the subject was one I could not hold directly without flinching. My daughter told me there was a bed at the east wall that Margaret kept empty, that a robin returned to every year to watch it, and that Margaret herself did not seem to know or would not say what she was waiting for. I stood at that wall this afternoon with my sister beside me, both of us old now, both of us far past the age where either of us can afford to keep wasting the years we have left on a grudge. Neither of us can even properly remember the shape of, any more, and I understood, all at once, standing there in the thin spring light, exactly what the bed had been waiting for. Not a plant, not even, in the end, an apology, though I gave her one. Finally, standing right there, the words coming out smaller and plainer than I had ever imagined they would. After 30 years of rehearsing grander ones, I never delivered. It was waiting for us to come back, both of us, together. It did not care, I think, in what condition we arrived, only that we arrived at all. The way I suppose gardens generally do not care very much for the specific shape of a thing, only for its willingness to be planted and to grow. Alice wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, unashamed, alone in the quiet kitchen with the fire and the lamp and the almanac open before her, and read on, the entries in Rosalind's hand continuing for some pages, describing a reconciliation that Alice understood, from the careful, unhurried way it was written, had not been sudden or complete or without its own remaining awkwardness. Two old women feeling their way back toward a closeness that 30 years of silence had genuinely damaged and could not simply be willed back into its original shape. But it was real. That much was plain in every line. Rosalind wrote of staying a week, and then another, of long mornings in the garden with Margaret, relearning, slowly, the specific language of soil and shade and companion planting that had once, apparently, been a shared inheritance between them as children, before whatever had come later had buried it. And then, near the end of that stretch of entries, a single line that made Alice go very still. "We planted the bed today," Rosalind had written. "Together. Nothing grand. Foxgloves. Because Margaret said they wanted a place with morning shade and afternoon warmth. And because I remembered, suddenly, standing there with the trowel in my hand, that foxgloves had been our own mother's favorite, though I had not thought of that fact in 30 years, had perhaps not let myself think of it, because our mother's death was so tangled up with everything that came after it that I had simply stopped visiting the memory at all, rather than risk what waited beneath it. The robin watched us the whole time from the wall. Margaret said he had come every year for as long as she could remember, and she had begun to think of him almost as a kind of relative himself, keeping the same vigil she had kept, for reasons neither of them could fully explain. When we finished, he came down from the wall and picked at the freshly turned earth for a while, and then flew off, and did not come back to watch the bed again that whole week, as though whatever he had been waiting to see had finally been shown to him, and he was, at last, satisfied. Alice read this passage twice, tears fully falling now, unself-conscious in the empty kitchen, and thought of the empty bed as she had seen it herself only a few days before. The same low box hedging, the same patient bare earth, and understood, with a small jolt of confusion that quickly resolved itself into a deeper, sadder understanding, that whatever Rosalind and Margaret had planted there must not, in the end, have survived. The bed she had stood before, that first evening, had been empty again, bare, turned and clean and waiting, exactly as it had waited before this reconciliation had ever taken place. She turned the page, searching for an explanation, and found it a little further on, in Margaret's hand again, dated some months after Rosalind's long entry, the handwriting carrying a grief so plain and so carefully restrained that Alice had to stop twice in reading it, to simply breathe. "The foxgloves did not take," Margaret had written. "I do not know why. We did everything correctly. The shade, the spacing, the timing, everything Eleanor's own notes would have told us to do. And still, by midsummer, they had failed, one by one, the way plants sometimes simply do, for reasons that have nothing to do with the care given them and everything to do with something in the soil or the season, or simple chance that no amount of careful tending can override. I did not tell Rosalind. She had gone back to her own home by then, the reconciliation holding, thank goodness, in its own quiet way. Letters now instead of silence, a visit planned for the following spring, and I did not want her to hear that the thing we had planted together, in that one perfect, unrepeatable afternoon, had not survived. I told myself I would simply plant something else before her next visit, something hardier, something that would not fail the way the foxgloves had failed, and she need never know. But I found, when the time came, that I could not bring myself to plant anything else there at all. The bed sat empty again, through that autumn and into another spring, because I understood, finally, sitting beside it one evening with the last of the light going gold across the wall, that the foxgloves had never really been the point. The planting had been the point. The two of us, together, hands in the same soil, after 30 years apart. The plant itself was only ever going to be a marker for that morning, and a marker, once its purpose is served, does not need to survive in order for what it marked to have been entirely real. I have decided to leave the bed as it is, not empty in the old way, the waiting way, the way it sat for so many years before Rosalind came back. Empty now the way a room stays ready for a guest who has already visited once and will, God willing, visit again. I find I do not mind the emptiness anymore. I find, in fact, that I have come to think of it almost fondly, as a kind of monument to a single, particular, imperfect, entirely sufficient afternoon. Alice closed her eyes for a moment, the fire's warmth on her face, and let the fullness of what she had just read settle properly into place. The bed had never been about the plant at all. It had been about the return, about two old women who had wasted 30 years on a grievance neither of them could clearly remember, finally choosing, in the last stretch of their lives, to choose each other instead. And about a garden, patient beyond any human capacity for patience, that had simply kept a space ready for exactly that choice, for however long it took either of them to make it. She turned the remaining pages slowly, reading now not with the urgency of someone chasing an unresolved mystery, but with the calmer, sadder attention of someone accompanying two old women toward the end of a story she already understood the shape of. The entries continued for several more years, Rosalind's visits becoming a settled, seasonal rhythm. Spring most years, the two sisters working the garden together for a week or two at a time, their handwriting appearing side by side on facing pages sometimes, as though they had taken, at some point, to sitting at this same kitchen table together, each writing her own account of the same shared days. Catherine appeared in these later pages too, though less frequently, brief visits mentioned warmly, a granddaughter's name Alice did not recognize, appearing once, twice, and then Alice understood, with a small, strange shock, that the granddaughter's name was her own, mentioned only in passing, a girl of 10 dragged along on a family holiday, sullen and bored, made to sit in a kitchen that smelled of drying herbs. She remembered that visit. She had thought, until this exact moment, that she had been entirely peripheral to it, a child present, but not really seen. She understood now, reading Margaret's brief, warm note about it, that she had been seen, after all, carefully, the way this whole family seemed to see everything, quietly, without ever quite saying so aloud. The entries thinned as the years went on, Rosalind's hand appearing less often, and then, near the final third of the volume, stopping altogether. Alice found the explanation a few pages later, in Margaret's hand, the writing noticeably shakier now, the words simpler, as though grief itself had stripped away whatever ornament her prose had once carried. My sister died in the spring. The entry read, no other preamble, no softening. She had been unwell for some months, though she had not told me the full extent of it, wanting, I think, to spare me, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of thing that had kept us apart for 30 years in the first place. This family's persistent, loving, entirely counterproductive instinct to protect each other from the truth rather than trust each other with it. I am glad, at least, that we had the years we did have. 9 springs, 9 plantings in that same small bed, none of which ever properly took. though we tried a different thing each time. Foxgloves, and then delphiniums, and then, one memorable year, a rose that Rosalind insisted on despite my telling her the soil there was wrong for it, and which died within the season exactly as I had warned her it would, and which she laughed about for the rest of that visit, calling it typical, calling herself typical, in a tone I had not heard from her since we were girls. I do not think I will plant anything there again. I think I will simply let it be what it has become, a place where two old women, for 9 springs running, put their hands in the same earth and remembered each time that they loved each other more than either of them had ever properly said, and that the saying, in the end, mattered far less than the returning. Alice read this final passage through tears she no longer bothered wiping away, and sat for a long while afterward with the almanac open on her lap. The fire burned down now to a low, steady bed of coals, the kitchen holding its particular deep quiet around her, and thought about the empty bed as she had first seen it, bare and clean and waiting, and understood that she had misread it slightly that first evening. It was not only Alice the bed had been waiting for, all these years since Margaret's own death. It had been waiting, in some sense, for the whole family, for whoever next had the patience and the willingness to put their hands into it and continue what 2 sisters had begun and never quite finished in 9 imperfect, entirely sufficient springs. Alice set the 7th almanac aside for a moment, unable, just then, to read any further without first standing up, moving, doing something with the feeling that had gathered in her chest until it seemed too large to hold sitting still. She went to the window above the sink and looked out at the dark garden beyond, the shapes of the hedges just visible as deeper shadows against the general blackness, and stood there for a long while with her arms wrapped around herself, thinking not in words exactly, but in something closer to sensation, the accumulated weight of everything she had read pressing gently against her from every side. She thought of the years she had spent, without ever quite noticing she was doing it, holding her own family at a careful, comfortable distance, not from any particular grievance, nothing so dramatic as 30 years of silence. Only the ordinary, unremarkable distance of modern life. A phone call, a fortnight instead of a visit, a birthday card instead of an afternoon, actually spent in a room together, the accumulated small choices that do not feel, in any given moment, like distance at all, and yet somehow add up, across years, to something that looks very much like it, from the outside. She had never thought of herself as someone who avoided her family. She thought of herself, if she thought of it at all, as someone who was simply busy, whose life had simply arranged itself, without any deliberate unkindness, in a shape that left little room for anything beyond the occasional obligatory gathering. Reading Rosalind's careful, unflinching account of her own 30 years, Alice found she could no longer quite trust that comfortable self-description. She wondered how much of what she called busy was, in truth, something closer to what Margaret had called fear so old. It becomes simply a feature of you, indistinguishable from the rest of your character. She did not reach any firm conclusion, standing at the dark window with her tea gone entirely cold on the table behind her. She only understood, with a clarity that felt important even before she could fully articulate why, that she wanted, very much, not to spend 30 years finding out the hard way. She returned to the table eventually and made a fresh pot of tea, moving slowly through the familiar small rituals of the kitchen, and sat back down with the almanac, but did not immediately open it again. Instead, she found herself turning back through the earlier pages she had already read, rereading certain passages the way you return. Sometimes, to a piece of music you have only just heard for the first time, wanting to hear it again before the shape of it has fully settled, before it becomes simply another thing you know, rather than a thing still actively surprising you. She reread the passage where Rosalind had first arrived at the gate, an old woman standing before a garden wall like a ghost who had finally worked up the nerve to knock, and found, on this second reading, a detail she had passed over too quickly the first time. Margaret had not rushed to the gate when she saw her sister standing there. The entry described a long, silent moment in which the two women had simply looked at each other across the width of the garden, neither one moving. Both of them, Rosalind had written, so plainly encased in the same nervous stillness that anyone watching might have mistaken the whole reunion, in its first several seconds, for nothing more than two strangers regarding each other with polite caution. It was Margaret, in the end, who moved first. Rosalind had written this carefully, as though the detail carried more weight for her than any other part of that whole, long, difficult day. She came to the gate and opened it herself, though I was still on the other side of it and could easily have opened it myself. I understood, watching her do this, that it was not really the gate she was opening. Alice sat with that image for a long while. The small physical gesture of an old woman crossing her own garden to open a gate for a sister she had not spoken to in 30 years, and thought that she had perhaps never, in her own life, done anything quite so simple and quite so brave. She read on, more slowly now, less driven by the need to reach the story's resolution, and more content, she found, simply to sit inside it, the way you sit inside a familiar room rather than hurrying through it toward a door. She found, in the weeks that followed Rosalind's first visit, a series of smaller entries she had skimmed too quickly the first time through. Brief domestic notes that carried, on closer reading, their own quiet significance. Margaret writing about relearning her sister's particular habits, the way Rosalind took her tea, the specific silence she preferred in the mornings before she had properly woken, the particular way she liked to be told rather than shown when something in the garden had gone wrong. Small things, the kind of intimate, unremarkable knowledge that accumulates between people who have spent real time together, and that had, apparently, needed to be relearned almost entirely from nothing after 30 years apart, as though the sisters had become, in some essential sense, strangers to each other's habits, even while remaining, underneath that, exactly who they had always been. Alice thought about this for a long while, turning it over the way she had learned, across these last several days, to turn over the Almanac's more difficult passages, and understood that this, too, was a kind of lesson, quieter than the larger one about silence and return, but perhaps just as important, that love surviving 30 years of separation did not mean love returning unchanged. It meant, instead, two people willing to do the slow, patient, sometimes awkward work of learning each other again, almost from the beginning, trusting that the underlying thing, whatever had made them sisters in the first place, would hold steady beneath all the small relearning required to make the present moment actually livable. She found, further along, an entry describing the second spring visit, and then the third, each one shorter than the reunion itself, but each one carrying its own small, specific texture, a particular argument about whether the roses needed pruning before or after the last frost, resolved, in the end, the way Margaret noted almost fondly, by simply doing what we had always done as children, which is to say, disagreeing loudly for the better part of an afternoon, and then quietly, without either of us ever formally conceding the point, doing it my way, because I am, apparently, still the elder sister, whatever 30 years of silence might have done to blur that fact in either of our minds. Alice laughed aloud, alone in the kitchen, at this small, unguarded joke, the first real lightness she had found anywhere in the whole long, careful weight of these 7 volumes, and felt, reading it, something ease slightly in her own chest. The sense that this story, for all its grief and all its cost, had not been only grief and cost. There had been real joy in those 9 springs, real laughter, the particular pleasure of 2 old women rediscovering. Gate opened, hands in the same soil, that they still, after everything, actually liked each other, not merely loved each other out of the blind, unchosen obligation of blood, but liked each other, chose each other, found each other genuinely good company. Across a decade of returning visits, neither of them had ever taken entirely for granted. She read, too, of Catherine's occasional presence in these years. Brief visits, mentioned warmly but without great detail. A granddaughter's schooling, a new job, the ordinary passing texture of a young woman's life glimpsed only sideways, through a grandmother's and a great-aunt's. Fond, slightly wistful notes about how quickly she seemed to be growing, how rarely, comparatively, she could be persuaded to visit, how much, Margaret had written once, we both wish she understood what waits for her here, though we have agreed, both of us, not to press the point. Having learned, the hard way, exactly what pressing a point too hard, for too many years, can eventually cost a family. Alice read this particular line several times, feeling its weight settle somewhere close to guilt, though she reminded herself, gently, that she had been a child then, and then a distracted young woman building her own separate life, and that whatever failure of visiting the Almanac gently mourned had not, in any real sense, been a failure of love on her part, only the ordinary, unremarkable failure of a young person's attention, which is so often, entirely without cruelty, turned toward the future rather than the past, toward the life still being built rather than the one already laid down and waiting. Still, she thought, sitting there, with the fire's last coals glowing faintly beside her, that she would like, now, to be different. Not out of guilt exactly, though guilt was certainly present, somewhere beneath the larger feeling. Out of something closer to the plain, simple desire the whole Almanac seemed, across 4 generations and 7 volumes, to be quietly recommending the desire to be someone who returns and keeps returning, rather than someone who waits to be asked. The garden outside the dark window held its patient silence, and Alice sat a while longer with that thought before finally turning back to the Almanac's final pages, ready now, having sat properly with everything that had come before, to read the story the rest of the way to its close. There were only a few pages left in the volume, and Alice turned to them slowly, aware, the way you become aware near the end of any long journey, that she was approaching not just the end of a book, but the end of a woman's life, recorded here in the same careful, patient hand that had recorded everything else, the seasons and the plantings and the decades of waiting, right up until, presumably, there had simply been no more seasons left to record. The final entries were brief, spaced further apart, the handwriting increasingly frail, but never once careless. Margaret's attention to the garden's small details, holding steady, even as her own strength, plainly was not. She wrote of a granddaughter, meaning Alice, though she did not use the word directly, referring instead to Catherine's girl, all grown now. I hear, living some busy city life I cannot picture, though I find I think of her more often than I would have expected, and wonder, sometimes, whether she has ever once stood in a garden and felt what I have felt in this one, or whether that particular inheritance has simply skipped her, the way certain things do skip a generation, waiting patiently for the one after. Alice pressed her hand flat against the page for a moment, an instinctive, unthinking gesture, as though she could somehow answer that question directly to the woman who had asked it, decades too late for the answer to reach her by any ordinary means, and thought, I am here now. I am standing in it. I have been standing in it for 4 days, and I do not think I have ever felt more entirely myself anywhere in my life. The very last entry in the Almanac was different from all the others in one particular way. It was not addressed to no one, the way the rest of the volume had been, a private record kept for its own sake, or for whichever family member might eventually come to read it. This final entry began instead with a name, Alice, it read, and Alice's breath caught entirely, her whole chest going tight and still, because there it was, her own name, in her great-aunt's frail, careful, unmistakable hand, written some time before the end, addressed directly and only to her. I do not know if you will ever read this. I do not know if you will ever come here at all, or whether this cottage and this garden will simply pass, after my death, to some solicitor's careful arrangement, sold to strangers who will never once wonder why there is a small empty bed at the east wall, tended and turned every season for no plant anyone living can name. I find, writing this, that I hope very much you will come. I have never told you why, in all the years I might have. And I understand now that this reticence, this particular family habit of leaving the important things unsaid, is exactly the thing I most wish to spare you, if I still have any say at all in what you inherit. So I will say it here plainly, since I could never quite manage it in person, in the 4 brief visits we were given, each one too short, each one ended before I had found the courage to say anything beyond the safe, small talk that circumstance seemed to demand. I loved your grandmother, my sister Rosalind, for the whole of my life. Even through the 30 years I did not speak to her, even through the years I told myself, and nearly convinced myself, that I did not. I loved your mother, Catherine. The autumn she stayed here and taught herself, more or less on her own, to be the kind of woman who does not let a promise lapse the way the rest of us so often have. And I find now, at the very end of a very long life, that I love you too, though I barely know you, simply for existing, simply for being the next in a line of women who have each, in her own turn, put her hands in this same soil and found there something worth keeping faith with. The bed by the east wall is yours now, if you want it. I have left it empty on purpose. One last time, not because I do not know what should go there, but because I have learned, across a great many springs, that a garden's finest gift is never really the flower. It is the invitation. It is the simple, patient fact of soil that has been kept ready, for as long as it takes, for whoever is willing, finally, to kneel down and begin. Plant whatever you like there. Plant nothing at all if that is what you need. Either way, I hope you will come and stand at that wall at least once, and let the robin, whichever robin it is by the time you read this, look at you the way generations of them have looked at all of us, patiently, expectantly, entirely without judgment, simply glad, I think, that someone has finally returned. With more love than I ever properly learned how to say aloud, your great-aunt, Margaret. Alice sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time after she finished reading, the fire gone now to its last few embers, the almanac open in her lap to its final page, and did not try, for a while, to do anything at all beyond. Simply sit with the weight of what she had just been given. Not a garden. Not really. A garden was only ever the vessel. What she had actually been given, across 7 patient volumes and 4 generations of careful, unshowy love, was an entire family's slow, difficult lesson in the cost of silence, and the deeper, harder-earned lesson underneath it, that it is never too late to put your hands back in the soil, even after 30 years, even after a whole lifetime, even, it seemed, after death itself, if you are willing to leave the right words behind for someone else to find. She rose eventually, stiff from sitting so long, and banked what remained of the fire, and climbed the stairs in the deep, settled dark of the cottage at night, and lay for a long while in the narrow guest bed without sleeping, turning the whole shape of the story over in her mind, and thought, finally, clearly, without any of the uncertainty that had shadowed the thought every other time it had arrived. Tomorrow, I will call my mother. She woke early the next morning, earlier than the birds even, the sky outside her window still holding the last deep blue of the night, and lay for a while simply breathing, feeling the particular clarity that sometimes follows a long, difficult stretch of understanding, the sense of a fog having finally lifted to reveal a landscape that had, all along, been simple and plain and only ever obscured by the fog itself. She made tea and carried it, as she had every morning since her arrival, out into the garden, and walked, without needing to think about the route any longer, straight to the east wall, where the robin, exactly as she had somehow known it would be, was waiting on its low section of stone, watching the empty bed with the same patient, expectant stillness it had shown her on that very first morning. She sat down on the grass beside the bed, the way she had before, and this time she did not simply watch the robin watch the earth. She reached out, instead, and pressed her hand flat against the cool, turned soil, feeling its particular texture, dark and soft and faintly damp with the morning's dew, and thought about Eleanor, who had built all of this from nothing, and about Margaret, who had tended it across the whole of a long, careful life, and about Rosalind, who had come back after 30 years and knelt in this exact spot with her sister's hands beside her own, and about Catherine, her own mother, who had learned to divide peonies here once and had made a promise she had not, in the end, quite managed to keep. Though the almanac's whole long story suggested, gently, that it was not yet too late for that to change. She took out her phone. The signal in the garden was weak, a single flickering bar, but it was, she found, enough. Her mother answered on the 3rd ring. her voice carrying the particular note of mild surprise that comes from an unexpected call at an early hour. "Alice," she said, "is everything all right?" Alice sat in the grass beside the empty bed, the robin watching her from the wall, the whole garden waking slowly into gold around her, and found, when she finally spoke, that the words came easier than she had expected, worn smooth already, perhaps by 4 days spent reading two women's patient, careful example of exactly how such things ought, eventually, to be said. "Everything's fine," she said. "I'm in the garden. I finished the almanacs." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Alice wondered, briefly, whether the call had dropped, and then her mother's voice came back, quieter than before, and carrying, unmistakably now that Alice knew to listen for it, the particular weight of 30 years of a family's careful, complicated love. "Oh," her mother said, softly. "Then you know." "I know," Alice said. "I know about Rosalind. I know about the foxgloves and the peonies and the promise you made and didn't keep. I found the whole story, Mum, all 7 books of it." Another pause, and then, so quietly Alice nearly missed it beneath the birdsong rising all around her, her mother said, "I always meant to come back in the spring. I don't know why I never did. I think I do." Alice said gently, "I think it's the same reason none of you ever said anything directly, for about 100 years, running. But I don't think it's too late. There's a bed here, by the east wall. It's been empty a long time. I was thinking of planting something in it this spring, and I wondered if you might want to come and help." The pause this time was shorter, and when her mother's voice came back, Alice could hear, plainly, unmistakably, the particular sound of someone smiling through unshed tears. "I would like that very much," her mother said. "I would like that more than I think I can properly say." "Then come," Alice said, simply, echoing, without quite realizing she was doing it, the exact, quiet invitation that had waited in this garden, patient and unspoken, for the better part of a century. That's really all any of it ever needed, I think. Just someone finally saying, "Come." They talked a while longer, the practical details of a visit beginning to take shape. A date, a train, the particular small logistics that turn an intention into an actual plan. And when the call finally ended, Alice sat alone in the grass for a long while. More, the phone warm in her hand, the sun climbing steadily now above the eastern wall, and looked at the empty bed, still bare, still waiting, though differently now. She thought, waiting the way a room waits for a guest who has already said yes, rather than the way it had waited before, uncertain, patient, beyond any reasonable measure, for a return that might never come. The robin, after a while, dropped from the wall and picked at the soil, unhurried, entirely unbothered by her presence beside it now, as though it, too, understood that whatever long vigil it had been keeping on behalf of this whole family, across however many generations of robins had taken their turn at the task, was finally, at long last, drawing toward its close. Alice stayed in the garden the rest of that morning, and then the rest of that week. And then, without ever quite making the decision formally, the rest of that month, calling her office in Bristol to make her resignation properly final rather than merely provisional, calling her mother twice more before the spring visit finally arrived, filling in, slowly and gently, the whole long shape of a family history neither of them had ever properly had the chance to share before. She learned to tend the garden the way Margaret and Eleanor, and, briefly, Rosalind and Catherine had tended it before her. Not all at once, not with any real expertise, but patiently, one season's lesson at a time, the almanacs themselves becoming, in the weeks that followed, less a mystery to be solved and more simply a reference, consulted the way you consult any trusted, familiar guide, for the specific practical wisdom of which plant wanted which particular kind of care. The weeks between that first phone call and her mother's actual arrival passed for Alice in a way that felt, looking back on them later, both entirely ordinary and quietly transformative, the accumulation of small daily rhythms slowly reshaping her into someone she did not think she had been before she arrived at the cottage. She woke early, without an alarm, the light through the guest room window, and the particular insistence of the local birds proving far more reliable than any clock she had ever owned in Bristol. She made her tea and carried it into the garden and walked its paths slowly, learning, almost without noticing she was learning it, the specific logic Eleanor had built into the space nearly a century before, which bed wanted morning sun and which wanted the cool of afternoon shade, which plants leaned toward each other in a kind of quiet companionship, and which needed to be kept carefully apart. She spent whole mornings simply weeding, a task she had always imagined, from the outside, as tedious, and found instead to be something closer to a form of meditation, her hands moving through the soil while her mind, freed from any other obligation, wandered back through the almanacs, turning their stories over and over, finding new details each time. The way you find new details in a photograph you have looked at many times before, a background object suddenly noticed, a particular expression suddenly understood. She called her mother most evenings now, the conversations growing steadily easier, less careful, more like the ordinary unguarded talk of two people who trust each other, and less like the polite, distant check-ins that had characterized their calls before Alice had come here. Her mother told her things, in these calls, that she had apparently never told anyone. Small memories of that one autumn spent learning to divide peonies, the particular quality of light in the garden at a certain hour, a joke Margaret had made once, that Catherine had carried with her, unspoken, for 30 years, waiting, it seemed, for a listener who would finally understand why it mattered. Alice found herself, in turn, telling her mother things she had not planned to share, small, anxious thoughts about the life she had left behind in Bristol, about whether leaving her job had been foolish or brave, or simply necessary, about a loneliness she had not fully admitted to herself until she found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely unlonely, here, alone, in a garden built by women she had never properly known. Her mother listened to these confessions with a patience Alice had not previously associated with her, and Alice understood, slowly, that this patience too had likely been learned here, in this exact garden, 3 decades before, passed down the same quiet way everything else in this family seemed to pass, not through instruction but through example, through the simple accumulated evidence of what it looked like to finally, after years of practice, learn how to listen. She spent time, too, simply sitting with the almanacs themselves, not reading forward for new information now, but rereading, slowly, certain passages that had lodged themselves particularly deeply. Eleanor's early notes about the foxgloves and their patience, Margaret's long meditation on the empty bed as invitation rather than absence, Rosalind's careful, unflinching account of 30 wasted years. She found that different passages struck her differently, depending on her mood. Some mornings drawing her toward the early volumes and their patient, practical wisdom about soil and shade, other evenings pulling her back toward the later, harder chapters. The reconciliation and its costs. The reminder that love, once damaged, does not simply repair itself, but must be slowly, deliberately, sometimes painfully rebuilt. She visited the village shop most days, gradually becoming a familiar enough face that the woman behind the counter, whose name Alice learned was Mrs. Price, began to ask after the garden specifically, remembering Margaret fondly, offering small, unprompted memories. She was a terror over the price of seed potatoes. That woman haggled with me for a full 10 minutes once over 4 pence, and God rest her. She was right. I was overcharging, and I never did it again after that. Alice found these small, local memories precious in a way she had not expected. Another layer of the Almanac's story confirmed and deepened by people who had known Margaret, not through her own careful writing, but through the ordinary, unguarded texture of daily village life. The empty bed at the east wall she left, deliberately, untouched through all of this, resisting the urge, which came to her more than once, to simply plant something herself in the weeks before her mother's arrival. She understood, by now, with a clarity the almanacs had patiently taught her, that the planting itself needed to happen together, that doing it alone, however well-intentioned, would miss the entire point of what the bed had been waiting, across so many years and so many hands, to receive. So she left it bare and turned it gently every week or so the way she had read Margaret describing, and visited it most mornings to sit with the robin, who continued to appear with the same patient regularity, watching her now with what Alice had come to think of, whether or not it was strictly accurate, as something close to approval. Her mother's train arrived on a bright morning in early spring, the hedgerows along the lane just beginning to show their first green, and Alice drove down to the small station to meet her, feeling a nervousness she had not fully anticipated, some old childhood uncertainty rising up, despite everything the last month had taught her. And then her mother stepped down from the train with a single small case and looked at Alice across the platform with an expression Alice had never quite seen on her before, open in a way that felt entirely new, and the nervousness dissolved almost instantly into something far simpler. They did not talk very much on the drive back to the cottage, and Alice found she did not mind the quiet, understanding now that this family's silences were not always the guarded, withholding kind that had cost Rosalind and Margaret 30 years. Some silences, she was learning, were simply comfortable. The ordinary quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words in order to feel close to each other. Her mother stood for a long while at the garden gate before going in. The same gate, Alice realized suddenly, that Margaret had once crossed to open for her own sister, and looked at the cottage and the wall of green rising behind it, with an expression Alice could not entirely read, some complicated mixture of grief and recognition, and, underneath both, something that looked very much like relief. "It looks the same," her mother said quietly. "I always thought it would have changed more." "Some things don't," Alice said. I think that might be rather the point of the whole place." Her mother smiled at that, small and a little unsteady, and reached for the gate and opened it herself, and they went in together. She began, in the evenings, to write in an 8th volume, a new one she had found, blank and waiting, in a drawer of the same cabinet that had held the other 7, its first page empty until the night she finally sat down and began, in her own hand, still finding its confidence, still slightly uncertain of the particular careful attention this family's tradition seemed to demand, to add her own observations to the long, patient record that had been kept here for longer than any single one of them had lived. "My mother is coming in the spring," she wrote. On that first evening, the fire settled low behind her, the whole quiet garden sleeping beyond the dark kitchen windows. "We are going to plant the east bed together. I do not yet know what we will choose. I find, strangely, that I am not in any hurry to decide. I understand now that the choosing was never really the point, only the willingness, in the end, to kneel down together, hands in the same soil, and begin," she thought, setting down her pen at last, of Milo the bookshop cat, and of a library that waited patiently for a daughter's return, and of all the other quiet, careful stories this same particular kind of family seemed, generation after generation, to keep finding itself inside of. The shops and the houses and the gardens that waited, without complaint, for however long it took, for someone finally brave enough, or simply patient enough, to come home. And she thought, closing the almanac gently for the night, that perhaps this was, in the end, the truest thing any of these old, careful, patient places had ever tried to say, that love does not need to be spoken aloud to be real. It only needs, eventually, someone willing to come back and kneel down and begin. The robin returned to the east wall again the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning through the whole of that long, gentle spring, watching now, not an empty bed, but 2 women, mother and daughter, kneeling together in the turned earth, their hands moving in the same patient rhythm that had passed down, unbroken, through 4 generations of women who had each, in her own time, learned the same slow and necessary lesson that some gardens and some families ask only for one thing in the end, and it is not perfection, and it is not even, really, an explanation. It is only ever this: someone willing to come back and to stay. And the garden, as gardens do, went on quietly, holding all of it, season after season after season, patient beyond any human measure of patience, ready, always, for whoever came next. Thank you for listening tonight, and for letting these words carry you gently toward rest. If this story brought you comfort, we would be grateful if you would like the video and subscribe, so that more peaceful tales like this one can find their way to you. Sleep well, wherever you are listening from. We will be here again tomorrow night with another quiet story to carry you softly into rest.